To coin a term from Sharon Burrow, there will be no jobs on a dead planet. I think it's really important to ensure that we're looking at companies transitioning and transforming at pace.
Hello, I'm ESG Clarity Deputy Editor Natasha Turner, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Nicola Day, Deputy Head of Rathbone Greenbank Investments, to talk about the just transition. So it's great to have you with us today, Nicola.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me.
So to start off, what are the areas that are most at risk of an unjust transition?
Yes, I think it's important to recognise that the injustices with the transition are at many different levels. So they're at a national level, the regional level, down to the industries impacted, and even different segments of society. In the simplest terms, those most at risk are those that have significant exposure to high carbon activities, but lack the ability and or the resources specifically for financing to manage the transition to a lower carbon world in an orderly way. And then I think we have to recognise that the area of industrialisation has created a huge global north-south divide, which has caused problems, and those most at risk of exposure to impacts from climate change are often the least that have contributed to the causes of it. So we have got this huge intra-generational divide as well with the transitions, as well as the intergenerational divide, where the problems will be passed on to the future generation. But I think the obvious examples of areas, particularly industries, that will be impacted are in the energy industry in particular, obviously the high carbon areas such as coal, oil and gas. There'll be many solutions that are needed to transition from that side. In particular, sort of coal is so dominant still in areas like China and India, and so it will cause massive changes in the workforces needed in those particular areas. And I think we also need to be mindful of the potential risks in the growth of the green economy and issues such as the quality of new jobs being created and the way in which the complex supply chains are managed, and ensuring community consent for new renewable energy development, for instance, are just as important as ensuring the workers and communities don't get left behind as we move away from high carbon industries.
Thanks, that was very comprehensive look at all those different levels, the country level, sector level, and so on. So going down, I guess, then to the company level, what are you looking for in companies to help determine whether it's going to contribute to a just transition or not?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is very much to look at whether the company is aligned with a credible decarbonisation pathway. So ideally at 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees as an absolute minimum. I think the recent IPCC report that we had, the AR6, the first report from that, is clearly showing that climate risk is still very much there. And so I think we really need to recognise that the most unjust outcome is the lack of any form of climate transition. And to coin a term from Sharon Burrow, there will be no jobs on a dead planet. I think it's really important to ensure that we're looking at companies transitioning and transforming at pace. We certainly look at from a top level in terms of how we look at companies. We've helped co-create, for instance, the net zero investment framework with other members of the IGCC. And this sets out a common framework for assessing whether a company is aligned with net zero, including areas such as greenhouse gas emissions data, looking at decarbonisation targets, their governance, their oversight, their lobbying activity. And these areas sort of give a framework, as well as we follow other work from initiatives such as the Climate Action 100+, which is an initiative really that ensures the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take necessary action on climate change. So we look at this analysis in terms of how a company may be aligned or misaligned with the net zero pathway. And then we combine this with an assessment of if and how well a company is managing the social risks and opportunities of this transition. So this can sometimes be as simple as asking whether they have a just transition strategy in place, but it will also look at strength of policies and practices in areas such as the number of roles being created, but also most importantly, the quality of jobs being lost and created. Because it's certainly no good going from sort of secure types of employment to insecure employment. So that quality is really important, that is managed. We also look at areas like human rights management and all their due diligence practices, and supply chain management and community relations. So there's a whole host of areas that we make sure that it's a really holistic drill down into companies, how they're addressing this.
So let's take an example then to finish off with. So if we take electric vehicles, which we've been hearing a lot about and seem to be a very good kind of environmental solution and becoming very investable. But if there's these issues around the cobalt mining and the worker practices there, how does that get justified as a just transition investment or not? What are the considerations there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, and it's one that is such an important challenge to look at with the just transition. And there are a huge number of positive and negative impacts that are very interconnected and that need to be balanced. So I think really picking up on my earlier point that the most unjust result is actually a lack of climate action. That's what will impact certainly the developing nations, the ones most impacted with inequality. So tackling the climate angle is really important. And even the current status quo involves significant negative impacts linked to resource extraction and unsustainable consumption. And that is before we even begin to contemplate the social impacts of climate change under unchecked emissions. So in an ideal world, of course, there would be no negatives, but we are unfortunately not there yet, which is why it's ever more important for investors to have the voice to make sure that we are drilling down the importance of change within corporate practice. So it's also ensuring that investors and companies properly understand where social and environmental risks might arise, that they have well developed and effective systems to minimize and mitigate those risks, and that there are effective grievance mechanisms in place should issues also occur. So with cobalt, for example, we have been working with the PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment, and part of a collaborative engagement on responsible cobalt sourcing. And this is very much focused on encouraging companies to improve their visibility and oversight of cobalt and wider minerals actually in the supply chain to minimize the risk of sourcing materials linked to conflict, child labor, and poor working conditions. And there's certainly a number of other wider solutions in place that we're seeing coming through now. So particularly in battery technology, for instance, utilizing other raw materials, looking at options there. And battery technology very much intertwined then with responsible sourcing commitments we're seeing from a number across industries, particularly obviously in the automotive industry as well, that's most at risk from this. Also looking at companies to very much intertwine the circular economy solutions that will be looking at recycling and reusing a lot of these materials extracted from the e-waste that we're seeing. And I think, this will not only be a risk to companies in terms of their responsibility for that sort of end-to-end responsibility for the waste, but it's also a huge opportunity. You know, as we see the demand for a lot of these rare earth materials increase, it will mean that industries really need to focus on ensuring that supply is there, and recycling and reuse will become ever more important.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. Well, it's great to talk to you today, and it seems like there's a lot of interesting areas to keep looking at in the just transition. So thank you very much for joining us.
Yes. Thank you very much, Natasha.